Hey folks, Curtis Stone here. We're going to continue on our series of the US states and Canadian provinces, all of them, and looking at what would be areas to avoid and what would be areas to consider when it comes to homesteading. So today we're going to be talking about the great state of Tennessee and all it has to offer and all it has to avoid, if you will. So I spent a lot of time in Tennessee. I've been all around. I've been across both sides of the state, Memphis to Knoxville, Chattanooga, Nashville. Been to all the major areas, and it's a beautiful state, beautiful country. It's temperate. It's fairly warm, but like temperate climates, it can succumb to scary weather at times. You know, really fierce winds and really, really heavy rains. Those two things are very characteristic of the extreme weather patterns of Tennessee. So that's something to consider. If you're not from the state, you're not familiar with it, you definitely want to consider that. Whenever you're looking at places to live that have weather patterns like that, you want to always look at and just go on Google and type in, say you're looking at the Jackson area or somewhere around here, type in average wind speed of, say, Huntingdon, Tennessee. You're looking around there. Check it out. And if you see anything over, 8-9 miles an hour on average, then that's fairly windy. And so I would try to avoid places that typically have a lot of wind. Some parts of Tennessee that I really like are up in this mountain range here, the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's just beautiful. And you can find a lot of good places there. However, Tennessee is a in-demand state in the U.S. A lot of people from the sort of, call it, woke states, California and such, moved to Tennessee during the COVID show and are still doing so because they're selling properties at a premium in Southern California and they're moving out to places like Tennessee, driving up the prices. And if you talk to locals, they'll tell you that. And they're kind of tired of it, but what are you going to do? That's the way it works in the U.S. You can move from state to state, and it's one of the great things about the U.S. So having said that, let's first talk about places to avoid. And I think it's going to be fairly obvious to most people is the major metropolitan areas you want to avoid. And I would definitely put more weight on Memphis. But, if you've been watching these videos, we just do these sort of generic 50-mile radius zones as general areas to avoid. It doesn't mean that you can't find a decent property down here in this region of Chattanooga. You for sure could. And I would be way less concerned about a city like Chattanooga, even Nashville, over Memphis. If you spent time in the state, you know what these cities look like. And Memphis, no offense to people who are from there, but it's a dangerous city with a lot of people who are multi-generations collecting welfare. And so, in a shit hits the fan scenario, those people aren't going to be all that useful. And in fact, they might be a liability to you. So I would stay way clear of Memphis. But up in these rural areas of Tennessee, you can find some beautiful spots, getting into some of these mountains, these mountain ranges. You can find nice rural properties down dirt roads that are away from the madness. You want to think about, let's pull up our highways here. And you always want to think about, those interstates as your primary veins that you don't want to be close to. You never want to be, a quick turn off an interstate, definitely visible off, from an interstate. You want to stay off those as best as you can. Not to say, though, that you couldn't perhaps find, what do we got here? That you couldn't find a decent place up in these zones, up in these mountains. Again, I say this in all these videos, I'll keep repeating it. It's like, as far as getting out of the way, with prepper properties, homestead properties, in the mountains and in the trees. That's what you want. In the hills and in the trees. Away from big farmland, away from highways, away from big spreads of concrete. As I've said many times before, there's a direct correlation between the amount of concrete and the amount of government. Thus, the the lack of freedom and the increased amounts of tyranny. Of course, being closer to a city like Memphis is going to be more of a liability because of, the poverty and the crime in that city, but also just the spread. It's a concrete jungle. It's a massive metropolitan area, and Nashville's fairly big too. Nashville is just not as dangerous, at least in my experience, as Memphis. So definitely want to avoid those areas. But as you come up to these mountain ranges, and coming over to the east side of the state here, some of the nicest properties I've seen in the United States have been up in these mountain ranges. And you can find, of course, when we talk about North Carolina, we'll talk about those areas too. But they're nice. They're beautiful areas, and they're well away from a lot of stuff. It's just they're expensive, and so that's what it comes down to with a lot of these places. So we always pick out some kind of good areas. Zooming in up here in the north east corner of the state. Look at this, where rural as rural can be. Mountain City here. This is look at this. Let's just click on our roads here. Not a lot of major roads coming through here, but that has pros and cons. Being so off the beaten path certainly has its pros and cons. It means that if you got to go an hour down a dirt road to get to a highway, so you can get to stuff, you got to factor that in. It's not necessarily to say that that's a bad thing. It's just that be prepared for what that looks like when you get on your homestead and you get started, because when you're getting started and you need a lot of stuff, then that's a lot of time spent in commuting, which is definitely something to consider. But, let's just zero in here and just look at a random property and just see what kind of thing we could find up in a zone like this. Mountain City, it's a nice little, small town. Looks like it's got some amenities though. It's got some stuff. There's a Walgreens, there's a Little Caesars. Not that these things are important to you, but you can generally tell at first glance the amount of amenities in a town just by the map when you see franchises. Not that I'm into these franchises, but it does. Franchises are smart. They're business models that have worked for a reason. And franchises always identify towns based on, if they're going to go on a highway, what's the traffic volume on that highway? What's the economic activity of a town? And you can always tell towns are in a growth phase when they have a lot of those little generic franchises. It's just an easy thing to tell. So a town like that might have some amenities. You've got a Dollar General over here and stuff. So there's some amenities in that town. And, if you have to head towards, say, Johnson City, it's not a super long drive. A bigger area where you might need to get things that you can't get in the small town, That's stuff you got to consider, right? But, just looking in here, let's just zero in and just look at a piece of land. I like this kind of thing coming up in between these two ridges. Imagine a little homestead property like this. Not a ton of land. It's almost at the end of a dead end road, but let's just imagine, draw it out here. What have we got? Let's just take a spitball guess. We got 5 acres there. You can do it on 5 acres. You can homestead on 5 acres. You got some pasture in here. It might be a bit of a fixer upper, but you've got some usable area in here. And not a ton. You're backed up right against the mountain. So a property like this, let's say, really only has an acre of usable land. So I would say, it's nice in Tennessee. With a warmer climate, you can farm on less land. But I'd say, probably not that great there. Not big enough for what we want in a homestead. Let's just see kind of what else we can find in here in our little zone. Little town of Wills. You get up into some of these areas here. A lot of small lots, though, actually, in here. something like this could be cool. Access through here. You've got, that could be a neighbor's place, and you could have an easement here. Decent sized house. They're doing some farming here, but let's just take a look and just imagine that, this is a big, like a 20-acre property. You're backed up against trees, which is nice. You got fields in here. You got a nice high ground landing for where the house and the main infrastructure is, which is great. So when you get into those long periods of Tennessee rains in the summer, everything just drains away from your buildings and infrastructure, which is great. If there isn't a pond here already, there could be, but that might not be on your property. If you were to capture water anywhere on this property, you'd do it pretty much right around here. You might have a ditch on the high or low side of that road, and then, you could even have let's just pretend this is the actual property line. You could have a pond in there if you wanted to. But, that kind of thing, that could be a nice little property. Let's look at some of the other spots here that we featured. This zone up here is pretty nice. It's kind of nice to be a drive to Nashville. I know myself as a music fan, I sure wouldn't mind if I lived 2 or 3 hours away from Nashville, I'd be pretty stoked. Anytime some really cool musician came through town, I might come into town and check it out. That's kind of a nice thing. But then you can kind of be a little bit into some of the country here. You could be kind of in some of these treed areas. Little town called Camden. You can get some neat spots. These are small lots up in here. Walmart in the town. You might want to come a little further out. Look at towards some of these dense treed areas along this river. Is that the Mississippi? No, it's not the Mississippi. Selmer, Tennessee, that's a great area. Ray Tyler, Rose Creek Village, Rose Creek Farms is in Selmer, Tennessee. It's a decent ways out of Memphis too. You certainly don't feel Memphis when you're out here. This felt very rural to me. But you get lots of nice, bigger lots on the edge out here into the trees. So, some kind of things you could consider there. Again, I like high ground in this region in Tennessee, because when you get into the rains, things can really flood. So you want to make sure you're not downstream from something. I know my buddy Ray, who lives in this Selmer region here. I won't locate their property for you, but they live downhill from a big cut block. And every time it rains, that cut block just floods through their property. So they've really had to spend a lot in drainage, culverts and things like that, to make sure that everything can handle the capacity when it comes, because when it rains, it pours. And so that's, some of the things that you really want to consider when you're looking at places in rural Tennessee. And I would say much in the same of a lot of this region in general, as it's prone to pretty scary weather at times. These temperate climates. Missouri's got it right now. St. Louis is just getting hammered with rains and potential tornadoes. And so I like to avoid Tornado Alley. I always would recommend, when you're looking at a specific place, always get on the U.S. FEMA map and make sure it's got a low score on the FEMA zone, that it doesn't have a recent history of tornadoes, and has a low history in general. That's definitely what you want to consider. But yeah, that's kind of Tennessee in a nutshell. There's good spots, but it is expensive, and it is there's a slimming down amount of inventory because people are moving out here. So this is where I say, think about Missouri, Arkansas. Think about places around here, even up in the same zone. Like, you could find maybe spots up in Mississippi here that are close to Tennessee, but are just across the border, that might be a lot cheaper, because people like to go to Tennessee. Maybe the same thing with Alabama or Georgia. I definitely wouldn't want to be anywhere near Atlanta, but we'll talk about all these other states eventually. So folks, if you like this content and you want to see me do more of this stuff and you want to learn about how I do this and maybe do it yourself, check out my free webinar where I tell you 3 secrets to eliminating crappy properties, my framework to how I assess the properties, and some Google Earth tricks. There'll be a link in the video. Go ahead and check that out, and we'll see you in the next one.